Good afternoon. I'm Victor Schaffner, Director of Communications and Advocacy with the University of Delaware's Center for Disabilities Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's Lunchtime Learning Zoom webinar, Literacy for All, presented by Dr. Karen Erickson. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Erickson will be presenting on how individuals with significant disabilities, those with complex communication needs, can acquire literacy skills and why they must be engaged in literacy instruction. She also will discuss practical techniques and strategies for educators, clinicians, and parents. After Dr. Erickson's presentation, there should be time for her to answer several questions. If you wish to submit a question, you can do so in Zoom's chat field by typing or by using speech-to-text dictation. I or another member of the CDS team, Tabitha Grow, will then pose some of your questions in the time we have remaining to Dr. Erickson. Today's event is being live captioned. In the coming days, we expect to load a caption video of the event to YouTube and our websites. Also, at the conclusion of today's lunchtime learning session, you will receive a brief survey that asks a few questions about the webinar. We ask that you complete it and send it back to us today or tomorrow. Dr. Karen Erickson is the David E. and Dolores D. Yoder Distinguished Professor in the Department of Health Sciences, School of Medicine, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She also is the Director of the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies and a professor in the Division of Speech and Hearing Sciences. A former special education teacher, Dr. Erickson focuses her research on literacy and communication for individuals with extensive support needs. Thank you, everyone, once again for joining us. And with that, I'll turn things over to Dr. Erickson.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here today and spent some time reading about some of the recent legislation and the work that's going on in the state of Delaware, and hope to make some links to that as we're talking today. As you've just heard, I direct a research center at UNC Chapel Hill, and our research center has a mission of promoting literacy and communication for individuals of all ages. And normally I don't begin by reviewing our mission, but given the invitation I received to talk today, I thought it was important for you to know that the last sentence of our mission statement says all individuals, regardless of their abilities or disabilities, have a right to an opportunity to learn, to read and write in order to increase and enhance their educational opportunities, vocational success, communicative competence, self-empowerment capabilities, and independence. And I feel like that's really important for people who are grappling with what constitutes literacy instruction, who should be receiving literacy instruction, and what might that instruction look like. To know that there are places like the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies where our central mission is ensuring that all individuals, regardless of their abilities or disabilities, have access to instruction. On this slide, in addition to seeing the link to the main Literacy Center website, which will then take you to all of our projects. But throughout the presentation, I'll be making reference to various projects that we're doing. All of them are school-based projects, and 3 of the 4 are focused on creating implementation models to improve the ways that students in K through 12 have access to high quality literacy and communication instruction. And the 4th project, Dynamic Learning Maps, is the alternate assessment based on alternate achievement standards that now is used in 23 states across the US, including Delaware. And the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies has been the lead agency in creating the professional development supports for DLM, or the Dynamic Learning Maps. So you can just get to the Literacy Center website at go.unc.edu/CLDS, and that will link you to all of the other projects that I'll be telling you more about. As I talk today, I want to be very clear that when I talk about literacy, I'm talking about print literacy. And when I'm talking about print, I'm talking about letters and words in print or braille. That we're talking about how do we make reading and writing traditional orthography a reality for all learners. We have just in the last 2 years been engaged in ongoing projects with the National Center on Deaf Blindness in order to make sure that we are expanding the work that we're doing to participants with a wide range of complex needs, including those with the most complex multiple disabilities who have vision and or hearing loss. So when we're talking about all, we mean all, and are every day engaged in work trying to create the solutions that make that a reality for all of our children who we're trying to support. Literacy, print literacy, is a focus of the standards that we follow and of a variety of legislation at the state and national level. The Every Student Succeeds Act has an entire section that's devoted to comprehensive literacy and defines comprehensive literacy in a way that's fairly consistent with the way that we talk about comprehensive literacy instruction at the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies. And I will be highlighting some of the things that are different. Delaware's literacy plan, with the most recent House Bill 304 and Senate Bill 4, also have a huge emphasis on literacy in ways that are fairly consistent with what we're doing. And again, I'll highlight the places where I think we need to go beyond what those state and national acts do if we're going to really make literacy a reality for all. And then we have English language arts standards, both the Delaware Common Core state standards and the Dynamic Learning Maps essential elements have an enormous focus on English language arts and the ways that through comprehensive English language arts instruction, we build students' abilities in the areas of reading and writing, listening, speaking, and language. There's a huge range of literacy, of research telling us why literacy is important for everybody. I've pulled some of the specific findings from that very wide-ranging body of literature. We know that literacy levels are directly related to educational achievement beginning from very early in the school years, that literacy has a large and statistically significant relationship with employment and earnings, even after we control for education levels. So in the United States, we're very focused on high school graduation as an indicator of success. But in fact, most of the research in the United States and elsewhere says that more important than the diploma is the level of literacy. And so potentially we need to be focusing more on maximizing literacy achievement for all, as opposed to focusing on the diploma itself. Importantly, for the population of people who have a variety of support needs, higher levels of literacy are associated with better health outcomes. When you think about the range of things that we've all been through in the last 3 years around this pandemic, we have had to all learn new vocabulary, and it seems like just when we feel like we figured out the new words, there are other new words that are come our way that we've either experienced ourselves or watched loved ones experience symptoms that we didn't have language to describe before. Certainly, if you're somebody who doesn't use speech to communicate, No one needs thought to program some of the vocabulary that we've needed in the last couple of years onto your augmentative and alternative communication device. Having the ability to read and write allows you to communicate about your own health, about your needs, and what the research says is higher level of literacy are directly related to your ability to adhere to medical recommendations. So literacy is important for everybody, for health and education and economic well-being as we move forward. But literacy is especially important for individuals with significant support needs. I make the argument that it's actually more important. The more significant your support needs are, the more important it is that we teach you how to read and write. Literacy provides this super important context to teach communication learning, or to teach communication. It fills this gap between receptive and expressive vocabulary. So from the time children are very young and all the way through adulthood, people who use speech as their primary means of communication understand many more words than they use on a day-to-day basis. But if we use speech to communicate, we're able to say any of the words that we know when and if we need to. But if you're an individual who uses augmentative and alternative communication, that includes things like sign language or communication apps and communication devices, you have a much greater gap between the words that you understand and the words that you can express. And the way that you fill that gap is through literacy. It is theoretically possible that we could program every potential word in English into an individual's computer-based AAC device, their speech generating device. Theoretically, we could do that. But the only way you'd ever be able to access the words that you want is if you had high enough literacy skills to search for those words when you needed them. So you'd be essentially spelling the words. So why not just spell them to begin with? There's a broad research based on people who use ASL about the percentage of words that they have to express using finger spelling because there isn't a hand shape or movement to be able to represent the word or the concept. We fill the gap if you can't use speech as your primary means of communication. Literacy allows you to fill that gap. It allows you to say the things that people didn't predict you were going to need to say, the things that other people don't think to program onto your communication device. Most importantly, literacy is the only symbol set that's going to allow somebody who doesn't use speech as a primary means of communication to say whatever they want about anything, anytime, and anywhere. We simply can't predict what it is people are going to need to say. And so we have to get to the place where people can use spelling and writing to communicate with the world if we want them to truly have autonomous communication. There's this very direct connection between literacy and communication. In the intro, you heard that I was a teacher of students with a variety of complex needs. I lived in upstate New York at the time. And I got interested in literacy because of the way that literacy supported communication. When I came back to graduate school to work on my PhD, I came back specifically with an interest in assistive technology, augmentative communication, and communication. And it was only after I enrolled in graduate school and started studying that literacy found me. Because what I came to understand was this connection between literacy and communication, and the ways that literacy improved communication from the very beginning of learning how to engage in symbolic communication. So this model, this interaction between reading, writing, speaking, and listening has been at the center of our work here at the Literacy Center for 3 decades. When this first paper was written in 1991 by Dave Copenhaver and colleagues, who Dave was the founder, the co-founder of the center, They had very quickly taken this model, which first appeared in the literature about children without disabilities in 1989. And 2 years later, they were publishing about the ways that this model would help us understand literacy instruction for students with a range of significant support needs. And what they helped us understand was that reading, writing, speaking, and listening develop concurrently and interrelatedly. That lots of the work that we had done historically in special education, where we would first expect children to learn how to listen and understand some of the language around them, which would then lead to the ability to do some speaking. And once students were listening and speaking, then we would start teaching them reading. And only after they had learned to read at a certain level would we start working on writing. Had this very step-by-step building blocks kind of approach. And with this work that was happening in the late 80s, early 90s, we came to understand that these things develop not one at a time, but in interaction with each other. And in fact, if we think about instruction in ways where we are systematically trying to integrate two or more of these abilities, we get the synergy that happens from the arrows that connect them. In very recent years, what we've come to understand is that what distinguishes the work we're doing from many others is the attention that we give to the arrows that are in the model. So as a special ed teacher, I was highly trained in an approach to task analysis, where I would look at the overall ability that I was trying to teach. I would break that down into manageable steps for the students that I worked with, and I would teach them each one of those steps to mastery. We continue to see that as the dominant approach to instruction for students with a range of significant support needs in our school system. And what we find is that all of those approaches are focused on the words in this model. So we have a variety of approaches that help kids learn to say words. We have a variety of approaches that help kids learn to read or to write words and sentences. But it's only when we have instruction that is integrating those that we really get to the kind of application and use that we know we're trying to get to for all of our students. So when we only focus on the words, we get the words, but we don't get generalization. The words meaning when we only focus on reading, writing, speaking, and listening. When we focus on the whole model in an interactive way, we get to this place where we're seeing the application and use of the things that we're trying to teach. For us, this model has been so critical from our friend Andrew Sheehan, who when we first met him was a 12-year-old seventh grader walking around with a Stephen King novel under his arm, that he was looking for someone who had read it to be able to talk to him about it because he was enjoying it so much. So reading skills way above his expectations given his age. He was speaking at the conference that we were at when I met him. He was presenting there. He had amazing public speaking skills. But Andrew couldn't write his own name. And Andrew had a very difficult time listening to anything beyond single sentence discourse. And what happened for Andrew over time is that Andrew was able to take advantage of his reading and speaking skills in order to build in the area of listening and writing. Today, Andrew is a very successful person in the world. He has written articles about his own struggle and the ways that taking this more integrated approach, not just looking at listening and writing individually where he really struggled, but being able to use reading and speaking to support him as he engaged in listening and speaking by doing things like using closed captioning to support his listening, using his reading skills, using speech to text, so speech recognition software to support his writing by using his speaking in order to do that. At the other end of the spectrum, this model has been really important to us as people like my colleague Patsy Pierce went into an integrated kindergarten classroom and was trying to help the teacher get a literacy program going that was inclusive of all of the students in the class. And the teacher wondered how in the world she was going to include this one child who came to school in laying down in a gurney, who spent most of the school day in a waterbed in the corner of the room, who didn't have any identifiable intentional means of communication. And the teacher really was struggling to think about how that student would be able to be engaged in the literacy program that they were building. But Patsy helped the teacher think about doing repeated readings with a storybook that had a repeated line. And the repeated line in that book was, "How about a hug?" And Patsy suggested that the teacher move her storybook reading circle over next to where the boy was in the bed. And when she did her typical kindergarten pregnant pause right before the repeated line, "How about a hug?" and the typical kindergarten children would all chime in with, "How about a hug?" And the children who had developmental disabilities would use their assistive technologies to be able to fill in the line, "How about a hug?" The teacher would lean over and hug this little boy in the bed and give him a hug as a way to include him in that lesson. Well, the little boy in the bed had a trach. And if you've ever hugged a little person with a trach, you realize that what happens when you hug them is you push air out of their body and you hear this come out from their trach. And so imagine this group of children gathered around a teacher who's reading the book. She gets to the pregnant, stops and pauses. 12 little 5-year-old voices chime in with, "How about a hug?" A couple of augmentative communication devices say the repeated line, "How about a hug?" The teacher hugs this little boy and he goes, "Ugh," because she pushes air out of his lungs. At the end of the week, Patsy is back there. She's a researcher taking field notes on what's happening in that classroom. Now the typical kindergarten children are basically reciting the book with the teacher, not just filling in the line. The other children with developmental disabilities are really actively filling in that repeated line each time. And when the teacher gets ready to say, "How about a hug?" and there's sort of this cacophony of responses from all of the other children, she leans over to give this little boy a hug and he goes before she hugs him. Now, he's not reading that book, and he's certainly not writing yet, but that shared reading interaction with all of the models that were provided by the other children in the classroom, with the teacher actively making sure that little boy got a hug with each time that line was repeated, allowed that boy for the first time ever to have a means of speaking, of intentionally expressing himself in some way by blowing his own air out of his own trach and independently going when he wanted to. That event led that team to help him learn to use that skill to be able to attract attention. Over time, they were then able to teach him to get started a yes-no response. They moved from a yes-no response to partner-assisted scanning. It all started from this integrated reading, writing, speaking, listening activity where the teacher was reading this book and figuring out ways to engage those children as listeners and as speakers as they were engaged with her. This is what's underlying the work that we're doing, trying to think about how do we provide instruction that allows all children to enter this model and then takes advantage of the connections between reading, writing, speaking, and listening to move children forward each day. I mentioned the sort of task analytic approach that I was taught to take as a special education teacher. In fact, we have a long history of those kind of reductionist approaches to instruction. And it's not just a history, it continues to this day, where we think about how to sequence skills in a hierarchy and teach those skills to mastery. So we might teach letter names or letter sounds to mastery. We might teach sight words. We might teach students to answer questions. But when we do those things without paying attention to the arrows, particularly with students who have significant support needs, what we find is very little evidence of generalization and use. So reducing things down, task analyzing, identifying and sequencing those skills, and then teaching them to mastery, we can help kids master those skills, but then they can't use them in ways that are meaningful. And the only reason we would teach skills like letter names and letter sounds is so that you can use them to learn to read and spell words. They don't have meaning on their own. They only have meaning in the application and use of them. So we have to figure out ways to move beyond this. This is one of the challenges of some of the current legislation, is that they're taking this science of reading that's been done with students. None of the children I'm talking about today were included in any of that science. Oftentimes, the first thing that happens is children get screened to make sure that they are able to demonstrate verbal intelligence and or receptive language within normal limits. So these are students who come to us with the arrows. They get the interaction between reading, writing, speaking, and listening. They understand when someone's reading to them that they're reading those words in the book. They're not telling a story based on the pictures. They understand that when people are writing, they're using letters to try to put those things down. They might not know how to do that yet, but they understand that. And so we have the luxury with those kids of just teaching the skills. And we can teach those skills to mastery, and then they use what they came to us with in order to apply those skills in the name of reading and writing. But we have decades of research with kids who have intellectual and other cognitive disabilities that demonstrate when we teach skills in this reductionist way, literacy skills in this reductionist way, they can't generalize and use those skills. So we spend an enormous amount of time teaching children sight words. Those sight words, we know from a broad base of literature with kids without disabilities, that learning words as sight words as if they were pictures doesn't contribute to your ability to read with comprehension in the long run. And yet we continue to spend an enormous amount of time teaching children to identify sight words in special ed classrooms across the country, but then they can't use those words to support their own reading, writing, and communicating. So we need to move beyond these reductionist approaches. We still need to teach the skills, but we can't just teach those skills in isolation to mastery. We have to be always thinking about what are the arrows in that model? How do we integrate? How do we focus on this application and use? So this reductionist view that is still pretty common, it talks about literacy being learned in this predetermined sequential manner that's linear, additive, and unitary, that there's one scope and sequence for everybody, and that you have to master skills in that order in order to become a reader and writer. It suggests that all literacy learning is school-based, that the place where kids learn about reading and writing is in the classroom with their teacher. This reductionist view suggests that these skills, these prerequisite skills, have to be mastered before you move on to the next. And so this single predetermined sequence becomes this series of gates and barriers that our kids have to demonstrate mastery in order to move to the next step and the next step. Well, we got a whole bunch of research that tells us that if we're going to take that approach, we're going to have a lot of students who really struggle. They're going to get stuck at low levels and never be able to move beyond that. The emergent view tells us that literacy is learned through interaction with and exposure to all of these aspects of literacy, reading, writing, speaking, and listening in an integrated way. An emergent view lets us know that literacy learning is a process that begins at birth, and in fact, there's evidence that says it begins before birth. That literacy learning, if you're alive, you are on the literacy learning continuum. And our job is through these rich interactions with and exposure to all aspects to move you a little bit further down that continuum each day. Emergent literacy helps us know that literacy abilities and skills develop concurrently and interrelatedly, that sometimes kids are going to learn much higher skills before they learn some of those basic skills. In our work with children with multiple disabilities, including deafblindness, several of those students the first symbol set they ever learned were the uppercase letters of the alphabet. And they were able to use the uppercase letter of the alphabet to spell in ways that familiar other people could understand their messages before they could use more traditional graphic symbols like you might see on an AAC system. That is not what anybody would expect in a predetermined sequential manner. People would expect that students are going to learn picture symbols before they would learn words. But in fact, given this emergent view and instruction that helped them take advantage of this integration of reading, writing, speaking, and listening, we have a variety of students that are showing us that they can write before they're using other means of communication to interact with people. Really importantly about this reductionist versus emergent view is an emergent view is what allows me to have the audacity to say that all means all, that every person can learn to use print meaningfully. If you take that emergent view and your goal is moving people along this continuum each and every day, there's a possibility. But if you take this reductionist view, there will always be children who will not be able to read and write. We will continue to have textbooks that claim to be textbooks about how to teach children with significant disabilities that have introductory chapters that define all of the characteristics of the children they're not talking about because their children whose disabilities are so severe that they couldn't possibly learn. As long as we have a reductionist view, we're going to continue to have people who talk about ways to accommodate and to avoid print literacy by using pictures and other means. So in order to stick to all means all, you gotta not be thinking in this reductionist way, and you have to think in an emergent way. And it's a big shift for lots of us to make. People like me who were trained, everything I learned through my master's degree was based on a reductionist view. Everything was about how do you break it down and teach those things to mastery. And I've had to take a complete different view of what teaching and learning look like in order to get to the place where we can walk the walk of all means all. So this literacy is a continuum. It starts at emergent. If you're alive, you are on the emergent literacy continuum. And our goal is to move you toward conventional. But notice that on conventional, there's an ongoing arrow. I have a PhD in literacy, but I get better at reading, writing, speaking, and listening every day. As I engage in more collaborative writing, as I am pushed to think and support the ideas that I have more and more, I get better and better and better at literacy. So it has a starting point, and that means you're alive. But there's no ending point to conventional literacy. We all get better at reading, writing, speaking, and listening the more we engage in all four of them. So this notion of emergent literacy, this is all of the reading and writing that people do before they can read and write in conventional ways. So it's very non-conventional, really risk-taking, trying to figure things out. It's absolutely dependent on context. So if I'm with a child when they're emergent and they're doing something, I might be able to understand a whole lot more about what they're doing and what their intention is than if I share that a product with somebody who wasn't there. So it makes perfect sense to me because I was there with them. A child who's able to read a word in the context of a book that's a favorite book that they've read repeatedly, but can't read that word when it appears somewhere else. They know it in that context. Emergent literacy is incomplete and inconsistent. So when I go to IEP meetings and people talk about the child as, well, they're so inconsistent, in my head, inconsistent gets switched to emergent. Inconsistency is what happens when you're emerging in your understanding. You don't get to the point of consistency until you're conventional. Emergent literacy is what allows us to explain how learners are making this progress each and every day. And And as we get better at developing measures and understanding assessments and the ways that we can observe these non-conventional skills that students are showing us, we get better and better understandings of what this emergent literacy stuff is. Conventional literacy, in contrast, is your ability to communicate meaning through traditional orthography. So reading, comprehending meaning, and writing, composing meaning, using print or braille. Conventional literacy is understood regardless of what context they're in. It's not error-free. So as I get started, anytime I'm doing a presentation, there's always some extra nerves and energy, and I make a lot of mistakes in the words I'm trying to say and what I'm trying to communicate. And it's not perfect, but hopefully the message is clear enough that whether you're participating in this today or you're watching this at some other point, you're able to understand what the message is. So it's not context dependent. It's not error-free, but it's not context dependent. Emergent literacy understandings develop as a result of opportunity and experience. They're described in a lot of different ways. I think this Seneschal and colleagues provide the most comprehensive list when they say that emergent literacy understandings include conceptual knowledge about the functions of print, perceptions of yourself as a learner, boy, that's a big one, procedural knowledge related to letters, sounds, and words, oral language understanding and use, not meaning spoken, your actual ability to say words, but your ability to understand words that are used in our face-to-face and oral language as opposed to written language. And then metalinguistic skills related to phonological and syntactic awareness. Our emergent literacy opportunities and experience have to be building all of these understandings, not just one of them and not in any particular order, but in integrated ways are we providing opportunity and experience that allow students to develop these understandings. Because you have to have these understandings to then be successful with conventional literacy, which develops as a combination of teacher-directed instruction and frequent opportunities to engage in meaningful and systematic reading, writing, and interactions with others. The Every Student Succeeds Act defines conventional literacy as a combination of phonological awareness, skills in decoding, phonics, and spelling, oral language skills with particular attention to vocabulary and other language structures, so syntax, reading fluency, reading comprehension, writing, all of those things happening together. We have to be building that emergent literacy base if we want students to be successful with our conventional literacy, our efforts to build these conventional literacy understandings. In the Delaware Senate bill, conventional literacy is defined as phonemic awareness, phonics, reading fluency, vocabulary, text comprehension, and oral language. And I just want to draw your attention to the fact that there's some things missing. Emergent literacy is completely absent. It's absent from ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and it's absent from the literacy plan for school-age kids. Now, it makes sense that it's absent because the vast majority of children who come to school starting in kindergarten very quickly transition from emergent into conventional literacy. The vast majority of what we're doing in K-12 education is supporting children without disabilities or with high incidence disabilities in getting better at conventional reading and writing skills. But if you're a student who has more complex needs, it's very likely that you have not had enough emergent literacy learning experience, so you don't have that basis. So when people then start providing you with conventional literacy instruction, you might master some of the skills, but you don't have the arrows to hold it together. You don't bring with it that understanding of how those skills can get applied and used in reading and writing and communicating. The other thing that I want to point out is your state literacy plan, like the one in North Carolina and many other states, totally leaves out spelling and writing and is focused on reading. And if you're a person who has complex communication needs, it's critical that you're receiving instruction that helps you get better at spelling and writing, because that's the key to your being able to communicate whatever you want, whenever you want, with whomever you want. So we need to be paying attention to emergent literacy and making sure that our students with more significant support needs are getting the kind of experiences that they need to build all of those emergent literacy understandings. And we need to make sure that we don't get so focused on reading that we forget about the really critical value of spelling and writing for students with more significant support needs. Important for us to communicate to everybody that emergent literacy is not age dependent, it is experience dependent. And we repeatedly have studies. We just, Sophia Benson Goldberg just did one in 2020, looking at the classroom-based emergent literacy and early literacy learning experiences of students in separate special education classrooms. And on average, those students were getting about 15 minutes a day. Teachers were teaching literacy for 2 hours a day. But our traditions in special ed are so focused on one-on-one or two-on-one arrangements that the teacher was teaching for 2 hours, but all individual students were getting about 15 minutes of instruction a day. No child learns how to read and write in 15 minutes a day. In public schools across the country, people talk about K-2, children getting 2 hours of literacy instruction every day. In most of the special education classrooms where this work is happening, children are lucky if they're getting 45 minutes of academic instruction a day, let alone 2 hours focused on reading and writing. So when we look at older children and adolescents who have more complex needs, who are still emerging in their literacy understandings, we have to look really carefully at what emergent literacy opportunities they've had throughout their lifetime. And oftentimes when we look back, they'll in 4 or 5 years of school not equal what a child without disabilities gets before Christmas time of kindergarten. It is opportunity and experience dependent. It is not age dependent. And so somewhere along the way, we need to make sure that that opportunity is being provided in order to help the learners get where we're trying to get them. So trying to think about, for any individual child, your own child, a child in your classroom, should the focus of your instruction be emergent or conventional? We've for years worked on ways to be able to assess children to figure out where to get started. And in the end, it turns out that these 4 simple questions are just changing everything for so many children, parents, and schools. So we ask 4 questions. First, does the learner know most of the letters most of the time? Not all of the letters all the time. It could be a combination of letter names and letter sounds, of uppercase letters and lowercase letters, but most of the time when you're working with letters, can the students identify them? We're trying to make sure that they have enough knowledge about letters that when we start using them in our conventional literacy instruction, they're not confusing them with numbers or other kinds of shapes or other kinds of objects. Does the student, our second question is, does the student engage actively during shared reading? And most recently, we've added a tag onto there that says without extrinsic rewards. So can you engage this learner actively in shared reading with you without dangling a carrot of some favorite activity that's going to follow? But the act of engaging with you in text reading is motivating in itself. We have to help children have enough emergent literacy experiences that they get to that place of active engagement, because reading with comprehension is an active process. You have to be engaged actively and cognitively in order to understand things that you're reading. We asked, does the learner have a symbolic means of communication and interaction? And then our final question is, do they understand that writing involves letters and words? If we have a yes, a solid yes to all 4 of those questions, we move on to comprehensive conventional literacy intervention. If we have 1 or more no's, any one no to any of those 4 questions, or if it's all 4 no's, we are doing comprehensive emergent literacy intervention. Until we get 4 solid yeses, we are sticking with emergent literacy, making sure that we're building that solid base of understandings so that when we begin conventional literacy, we maximize the likelihood of success. We take a routines-based approach, and we're doing each of these routines each day, either emergent or conventional. And the projects that I mentioned when I first introduced myself are all based on trying to support this notion of comprehensive emergent and comprehensive conventional literacy instruction. So if you are answering those questions for a student that brought you here today and you get 1 or more no's, I'm going to point you to the Project Core website or to the sharedreader.org website, where we have comprehensive professional development and instructional supports, all open source, all available on demand, in order to support you in teaching those routines to individuals with significant support needs who are emerging in their understandings of literacy. If you have a solid yes to each one of those questions, I would point you to our DLMPD or the Building Bridges ELA website. And I'll tell you that everything people are telling you about the literacy plan and about the science of reading is going to apply, except you have to not, I want to encourage you to go back to the reductionist versus emergent notion. This idea that if we try to teach everything using unitary approaches in unitary hierarchies, so here's the sequence, everybody has to learn it, we're setting up barriers for our kids with the most complex needs. And we want to make sure that people are understanding that learning can happen without sequential mastery of those skills. It's not that those skills aren't important. It's that we can't always predict the exact order that our students are going to be learning them in. Last thing I want to say is that all of this stuff works best if you have interprofessional teams. Teachers are critical. I live my life with the bias that teachers are the answer to every problem that we have. I don't think teachers are the problem. I think teachers are the solution. They're the ones who can make sure that students are given adequate time and that they're provided access to the general curriculum and the kind of instruction that they need. Families are critical. They help us understand so much about what students' experiences are, what their interests are. Speech language pathologists, occupational therapists, even the students themselves are really critical members of this team that is going to be the most effective way for us to be making sure that literacy happens for all. But it only takes one person. Repeatedly in the work that we've done, when we ask individuals who have beaten the odds, when we talk to the now 39-year-old who, when we met him, didn't even have a yes/no communication response and didn't understand much about symbolic communication, let alone literacy, who now writes and use writing as his primary way to communicate and interact with the world. When we ask him, he points to his mom as the one person. David Copenhaver and colleagues in 1992 interviewed a bunch of adults who had significant physical disabilities and used AAC, and every one of them could point to the one person who made literacy possible for them in their life. So teams are important, and we want to build teams and we want to support teams, but none of us can wait for the team to get together. We just need to be that person and get started. And I think that the Center for Literacy and Disabilities has a bunch of resources, all of them open source, all of them available to you. And our research is showing that these resources and the programs that we've built will allow you to work towards that all means all, in helping all students achieve literacy, in helping all students learn to use reading and writing to support their communication and interaction with the world. And I will wrap up there and see if you have any questions. I think you might, there you go. Can you start over? Because you were on mute. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Karen, thank you very much for your presentation. And we do have time now to take a number of questions that have come in before we wrap up our event. So let's get to some of these. How do we close the gap for students who are already in transition stages of their school education and are in that group of students traditionally thought unable to develop literacy skills? What are things that families, caregivers can do to help develop these skills?
Yeah, thanks for that question. This idea that literacy is not age dependent is really important. In the research that we do, we're consistently finding that that we can't use age as the to more directly answer your question, some things that you can do. One is think about ways that you continue to incorporate literacy, learning, and use in all of the activities that are happening throughout your day. Think back to the kinds of things that you might have done with young children in your house, like including your soon-to-be adult child in writing grocery lists, in writing thank you notes, in going to the public library to check out books, in sending text messages and emails to the people that they care about in their lives. And all of those activities are likely to need to be mediated at this point. You're going to need to support them, but to think about how do you maximize those opportunities. In addition to that, continuing to lobby if your child is still school age, so they're still engaged in transition services through the school, to advocate for there to be some period of time every day where literacy instruction continues all the way through school exit. We have this thing that started where people were thinking if students weren't reading and writing by middle school, that you should give it up and focus on functional skills. And it's just not true. And people can continue to learn to read and write all the way throughout their lifetime. And we now have a variety of really effective instructional programs that are appropriate for older learners. And during the pandemic, lots of parents were signing up for programs like Readtopia, which is an online, it's not online, but the materials are delivered via the web, but it doesn't have to be completed online. It can be printed and done in a paper format. Readtopia is from a company named Building Wings. The Center for Literacy and Disability Studies helped develop that, and the center gets royalties on the sales, just to be very clear about it. I don't personally, but the center does. And that is comprehensive instruction on topics that are appropriate for adolescents and adults. And I think advocating for your school systems to continue to teach literacy all the way through, not just I don't want to use that word just, in addition to the other kinds of transition programs that are quite prevalent for students with significant support needs. So those are just some places to start. The sharedreader.org will give you some really great ideas for how to engage in shared reading with your adolescent or adult child in ways that are respectful of their interest and their age, but help them build some core understandings.
Thank you, Karen. Another question. Given that recent Delaware legislation is based on teaching educators the, quote, science of reading, how would you suggest Delaware proceed regarding meeting the needs of children with complex communication needs so it's doable for teachers?
Yeah, so I would argue that the work that we've been doing at the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies is our very best effort to make the science of reading work for students who have complex communication needs. And so at the core of the instruction we provide every day for conventional readers and writers, you will find systematic phonics and spelling instruction. And we integrate that systematic spelling and phonics instruction each day with instruction focused on text comprehension, fluency building, but silent reading fluency, not oral reading fluency, and supporting writing development, because we think that is such a critical piece. So I would try to help the people who are building the training and who are doing that support. I know that in your state over the next 2 years, they're going to be adopting a short list of curricula, advocating to get people on that committee who understand complex communication needs and understand that you can't just program words onto devices or program the phonemes, the sounds onto devices, and have kids say the same thing that everybody else is saying, but they're going to say it using their device instead of their speech. All kinds of evidence that that's very performative, but isn't leading to the kind of skill development that we need in order for those kids to become spellers and decoders. So getting people who understand complex communication needs, literacy, and language onto those committees to make sure that as curricula are being reviewed, it's very carefully reviewed to make sure that it's accessible to kids who don't use speech to communicate, or that there are alternatives available for kids who don't use speech to communicate. Making sure that people understand who the children are that were involved in the research that's behind the science of reading, and helping people recognize that so much of that research begins by screening students who to make sure that they have receptive language and or verbal intelligence within normal limits, and to make sure people are thinking about what that means instructionally, the difference between a child who does and does not meet that need. And so continuing to inform at the policymaker level, advocating to make sure that there's representation on those boards that are making those selections. And then I would argue for creating supplemental trainings that might be available that align with what the teachers are learning as they're in the science of reading training, but make it very clear what from that training does and does not apply to students who have a range of significant support needs.
Thank you, Karen. We have a number of other questions that are coming in, so we will get to as many of these as we can. We may go a few minutes past the hour if that works for you. The next question is, many of our students also get ABA therapy, where everything is completed in short spurts, always for an extrinsic reward. How do you move from this to engage them in reading for the sake of reading?
Yeah, so one of the projects we did this summer was in an extended school year program with a group of children whose school year program was totally based on ABA. And so there were some things that we had to continue doing, and then we had some flexibility because it was extended school year. One of the first things we did is we started being very intentional about using work to describe the work that they were doing in their more structured teaching environment, because that's what it had always been called. Like kids were what are you working for today? What are you going to do when you finish your work? And so we were very intentional during our literacy instruction about calling it learning. And when anybody would dare to call it work, we would say, oh, we're not working, we're just learning. And you wouldn't believe what a difference that made in the children's ability to be flexible in moving into the ABA, where it's very structured, where there are always right and wrong answers, where children actually don't take a lot of risks. That it's just structured in a way that there's no reason. But in our literacy instruction, we want kids to try to figure things out. There are not always right and wrong answers. We want to know what they think. We want their interpretations. We want their ideas. We want them to try things before we've shown them what the answer is. And oftentimes in their work time, they first are shown the answer and then they're asked to repeat that. And so that was one of the things we did, is we carved out time during the day when we focused on literacy learning. And we were very intentional about the language that we used during that learning time. We also then had to think about ways that we were expanding on their communication. So they had been using their AAC during their more structured teaching time in only a response mode. So they could show us anything we asked, but they couldn't use it to initiate and respond. And so even though these students had 3 of 4 yeses, they all knew all of the letters all of the time. They all had a means of symbolic communication and interaction. They all understood that writing was about letters and words, but they were completely not interested in shared reading. And so we used what the approach that is described in sharedreader.org to help these students learn to initiate, to ask their own questions, and to interact. And that structure of shared reading that we lay out in sharedreader.org was what shifted the kids so that we then could be moving into other instructional routines that didn't always have right and wrong answers, that were not about just expecting students to give back a targeted response. And so I would say carve out a time during the day, talk about it as learning time, make sure nobody calls it work so that you can differentiate when they're working and when they're learning. And think about starting with shared reading as a place where you can be building some risk-taking, some initiating, students asking questions, students making their own connections, not more being a little bit more passive and waiting to respond to the directive that they're being given in their structured approaches.
Thank you, Karen. We're slightly past the top of the hour, but are you able to take a few more questions?
I sure can, yeah.
Great. For those who are not familiar with down and dirty strategies that support emergent literacy, could you talk about a couple strategies that enrich literacy and learning opportunities in the classroom?
Yeah, so shared reading would be one of the most important. A second one is kind of a simple strategy where we're teaching kids about the letters of the alphabet. When we're teaching the alphabet, we teach uppercase and lowercase, letter name and letter sound all together. So as we're teaching letters, upper, lower, name, and sound all together each day. And we have a history of thinking about doing things like that with a letter of the week. But the research that we relied on is some really nice research that helped us understand the value of focusing on a different letter each day. So in a really short 10-minute period, we engage in this routine called enhanced alphabet instruction. And now, enhanced alphabet knowledge. If you Google enhanced alphabet knowledge, you'll find this routine written up in a variety of ways now. But we show students the upper and the lowercase letter. If we have kids who need Braille, we present the Braille in uppercase, single letters in uppercase and lowercase form. We then tell them the name of the letter. This is an A and this is an A. We tell them the sound the letter represents, and we teach the sound the letter represents for vowels. We teach that it represents the what we would most of us know as the short vowel sound. And then we teach students that when you see this letter in writing, it can represent its sound or its name when you're reading and writing. And so we show them the upper lowercase, we teach them the name upper lowercase, we teach them the sound to go with the upper lowercase. We then look for that letter in real text that's around the classroom, and then we practice writing or selecting it from whatever pencil or alternate pencil our students might use, so a keyboard, for example. So shared reading, teaching the alphabet, but teaching all 4 of those things in this routine each day. And then another strategy would be having students write for their own purposes each day, even before they know what the letters of the alphabet are. We're giving them access to a pencil to write with, or what we call an alternate pencil, in order to begin to engage in the kind of really early emergent writing, scribbling, drawing we see young children without disabilities getting to do for 3, 4, and 5 years before we ever expect them to use a pencil to be able to write in ways that other people can understand. All of those are strategies that you can learn a whole lot more about just by going to projectcore.com and accessing the modules that are available there. And there are a variety of resources there and also on the DLMPD site that would support those strategies.
Thank you. What would you suggest in explaining to teachers that high school students still need to address literacy and how to make materials age and grade appropriate?
Yeah, so that was a big part of the challenge that we were trying to address when we created the Readtopia program with the Building Wings company. And Readtopia is, we have units on things like the Tuskegee Airmen and on Romeo and Juliet. So we've completely handled the age appropriate, but it also addresses from earliest emergent understandings up through fairly high levels of conventional. Beyond that, we have a website called Tar Heel Reader, all one word, Tar Heel. It's the if you're a sports fan, the Carolina Tar Heels. So tarheelreader.org is a website that we created that right now there's about 75,000 books on that site that have been read 15 million times around 214 countries. Our goal in creating that site was to provide a way for teachers to easily create books that were open source books that would be age and ability appropriate for adolescents who are beginning readers. And so if you go to the tarheelreader.org site, you can read any book that's there without registering or doing anything. But if you register at that site, again, it's an open source free. We register just to keep the bad guys away so that we don't open it up one day and have a porn site instead of a reading site. And at tarheelreader.org, you can write any of your own books. And some of our most successful projects have been when high school students without disabilities have, for a service learning project, written books for Tar Heel Reader about topics that are locally interesting to them and the students with disabilities in their school. And it's just been, it results in books that end up being the most frequently read books. We can look within regions based on IP addresses and see huge numbers of reading of the book about the Friday night football win that somebody wrote as a service learning project and every kid in the school read it on Monday. So that would be a place where you can create your own, or you can find books that other people have written that are beginning level, fully accessible books.
Thank you. Another question. Our 12th grader has Down syndrome. She continues to be emerging in literacy. We constantly work on these skills. We were finally able to get a reading specialist to work with her. How do we get districts to supply reading specialists to special education in all grades?
Yeah, so trying to get people who truly have a master's degree in reading as opposed to people who have been trained in a particular approach to reading is an interesting challenge that we've tried to fight in lots of ways. So I think number one, use the power of an IEP in order to do that. If your child needs, for example, speech language services, your school is required to find someone who is a licensed speech language pathologist to provide those services. If your student needs literacy, reading intervention, and you can get it into the IEP, I think I would encourage you to advocate and ask what's the level of training that the person who's going to be providing that instruction has received. The other thing that we do that often helps with this issue is we'll take that list of either emergent or conventional, the skills that I talked about earlier in this presentation. Hang on, I can take you back to that list here. And we ask, let's see, here you go. we will ask who each day is teaching my child conceptual knowledge about functions of print, helping them develop their view of themselves as a learner, teaching them procedural knowledge related to letters, sounds, words, right? So we look at these, we look at the skills that are conventional depending on where the student is. And then we ask who's teaching it every day, where is it happening, and for how many minutes is it happening? And what we often find is that there's somebody who's teaching one or two of them, but there's nobody teaching all of them. And then in the context of that team meeting, as we're asking, okay, so these are all of the things that have to be taught. When is it happening, and who's teaching it, and who has the skills to teach it? If they don't have the skills to teach it, then you can say, so where are we going to find the person who does have those skills? Where is that person going to come from? And so it's just one of the ways that we've been able to try to support that over time. And I just realized I didn't even share my screen. I went through all of that and you couldn't see what I was showing you, could you? So sorry.
Thank you. We'll just take one or two more questions, and then we'll wrap for today's afternoon event. For young adults no longer in school services, whose literacy was limited to the reductionist view and teachers giving up due to inconsistencies despite exhibiting the emergent literacy you've described, where should families look to find resources to continue reading instruction post-school, with that delivered by reading professionals who adhere to this emergent view?
Yeah, so a couple of things. Locally, we're trying to work with a local group that actually started as a group to provide meaningful work experience in our community. And so we're working with them. They thought that they wanted to do a book club, but as we started talking to the adults who are in the group that are self-advocates, what they want is to learn how to read and write. They don't want to just go to a book club that somebody reads to them and then they talk about that book. They want opportunities to learn more about reading and writing. And so taking advantage of those kinds of community groups, looking at local universities, reaching out to particularly seeking out people in local schools like speech language pathologists and special ed teachers who have a particular interest that might be willing to volunteer to help set up programs. I think one of the things that's really important is we all want to believe that literacy learning requires some special reading specialist who has some particular skills. But in fact, even when we find those people, we end up having to do a lot of work to help them learn about the special characteristics of the individuals that we're working with that have a variety of disabilities. And so I think that oftentimes those of us who know and love these people the most can have the biggest impact by working with people who have that expertise, as opposed to looking for that person that we could hand our kid to let them be the teacher. That oftentimes we have to do that together. We've had a group, there was a group in Atlanta that was successful, this is a few years ago now, at getting the local public library to start doing reading groups with young adults with a variety of developmental disabilities in order to support them in continuing to develop their reading skills. And so I think it's going to take creating some things. I've been on a personal crusade trying to get the college programs that are popping up all over the country for older adolescents and adults with developmental disabilities to keep literacy on the forefront as required coursework. Because boy, we could do a whole lot in 2 years to build some literacy skills of these students while they're on campus. And they're getting opportunities to participate or to take classes that their peers are taking. But oftentimes that's requiring a lot of tutoring and support for them to learn the content. And they're not getting that opportunity to build some of those core skills that they really, in literacy, they're learning lots of skills. I'm not talking about that, but it seems like a missed opportunity to really be building some awesome college campus based models of adult literacy instruction for this group of adults, oftentimes who are, yes, getting into these programs, but they still don't have the literacy levels that you would expect that they might have. So thinking about reaching out to those college programs, reaching out to people in your area who have an interest in this, and would they be willing to help create those sort of community-based programs?
Well, on behalf of the Center for Disability Studies, I want to thank you, Dr. Erickson, very much for joining us here today and providing us with a wealth of information. Also, thank you very much for going past the hour by several minutes to take as many questions as possible from our attendees today. Also want to thank everyone who registered for today's program and joined us, and to remind all of you to please complete the survey that will be sent to you asking you questions about today's presentation. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today, and have a pleasant afternoon.